Hello friends and history buffs, how are you? Today, we're traveling to the heart of Waterloo, that dark day when a giant fell to its knees and the map of Europe was redrawn. If you found this magnificent and terrifying historical journey interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to join our family. Also, while thinking about Waterloo's endless rains, I wondered, what's your favorite music to listen to on rainy days? Let's meet in the comments. The Battle of Waterloo took place near the town of Waterloo in present-day Belgium. It was the final confrontation between Napoleon Bonaparte, who had returned from exile on the island of Elba, and the Seventh Coalition, led by the Duke of Wellington from Britain and Field Marshal Blücher from Prussia. This battle is often remembered as the end of an era where Napoleon's dreams of empire were shattered and the old order of Europe was restored. But how did it come to this? How did one man rise to command the fate of nations, only to face his downfall on a rainy day in June? To truly understand the significance of Waterloo, we need to explore the events that led up to it, the ambitions of Napoleon, the fears of Europe, and the alliances that were forged to bring him down. Let's delve into the detailed events leading up to the Battle of Waterloo, a pivotal moment in European history. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte's journey to the battlefield of Waterloo began many years before, rooted in the French Revolution and the upheaval it caused across Europe. Born in Corsica in 1769, Napoleon rapidly rose through the military ranks during the French Revolutionary Wars, demonstrating exceptional leadership and strategic acumen. By 1799, he had seized power in France through a coup d'état, eventually declaring himself emperor in 1804. Napoleon's reign was characterized by a series of military campaigns known as the Napoleonic Wars, which pitted France against various coalitions of European powers. These wars saw Napoleon establish French dominance over much of Europe, defeating armies from Austria, Prussia, Russia, and others. His military genius and the revolutionary fervor he inspired made him seemingly invincible. And by 1810, much of Europe was either directly controlled by France or allied with it. However, Napoleon's ambitions were vast, and his aggressive expansionism began to stir growing opposition across Europe. His decision to invade Russia in 1812 marked the beginning of his decline. The campaign was a disaster. Napoleon's Grande Armée suffered catastrophic losses due to the harsh winter, logistical failures, and the Russian scorched earth tactics. This defeat emboldened his enemies, leading to the formation of the Sixth Coalition, the fall of Napoleon, and his exile to Elba. The Sixth Coalition, consisting of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and several German states, launched a concerted effort to defeat Napoleon. The pivotal battle of this coalition was the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, also known as the Battle of Nations, where Napoleon's forces were decisively defeated. This loss led to the invasion of France in 1814, and by March of that year, Paris had fallen to the coalition forces. Facing insurmountable odds, Napoleon was forced to abdicate on April 6, 1814. The victorious Allies exiled him to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, where he was allowed to retain the title of emperor but ruled only over the islands. 12,000 inhabitants. Meanwhile, the Bourbon monarchy was restored in France under King Louis XVIII, and Europe began the process of negotiating a lasting peace at the Congress of Vienna. Napoleon's return in 100 days. Despite his defeat and exile, Napoleon remained a figure of immense influence and ambition. His time on Elba was marked by restlessness and a growing desire to reclaim his former power. The Bourbon Restoration in France was deeply unpopular among many segments of the French population, particularly among the military, which had grown accustomed to the glory and rewards of the Napoleonic era. Sensing this discontent and knowing that his former soldiers and supporters longed for his return, Napoleon decided to make a daring move. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with a small contingent of loyal troops and sailed back to France. Landing on the southern coast near Cannes, he began a march towards Paris, gaining support along the way. Louis XVIII sent troops to arrest him, but in a dramatic confrontation, Napoleon approached him alone, opening his coat and declaring, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish," instead of arresting him. The soldiers joined him, and his march became a triumphant procession. By March 20th, 1815, Napoleon had entered Paris without a shot being fired, and Louis XVIII fled the city. Napoleon's return, known as the 100 Days, sent shockwaves across Europe. The Allies, still meeting at the Congress of Vienna, were stunned by his audacity. They quickly declared him an outlaw and began to assemble their forces once again, determined to end his rule once and for all. The formation of the Seventh Coalition in response to Napoleon's return. The European powers formed the Seventh Coalition, which included Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and several smaller states. They agreed to mobilize their armies and converge on France from different directions to crush Napoleon, before he could consolidate his power. The coalition's leaders, particularly the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian Field Marshal Gebhard Lebrecht von Blücher, recognized that swift and decisive action was necessary to prevent Napoleon from regaining his former dominance. Napoleon, aware that his only chance of maintaining power was to defeat the coalition armies piecemeal before they could unite, began to prepare for a preemptive strike. He rapidly reorganized his army, raising new troops and recalling veterans who had served under him during his previous campaigns. Despite the enthusiasm of his soldiers, Napoleon faced significant challenges. France was exhausted from years of war, the economy was in ruins, and the political situation was unstable. The campaign of Waterloo begins. Napoleon knew that time was not on his side. The coalition armies were already mobilizing, and if they were allowed to combine their forces, they would overwhelm him. His strategy was to strike quickly, defeat the British and Prussian armies in Belgium, and then turn his attention to the Austrians and Russians. By defeating his enemies one by one, he hoped to force the coalition into negotiations and secure his position as emperor. In June 1815, Napoleon launched his campaign by moving his army into Belgium, where the British and Prussian forces were concentrated. His plan was to drive a wedge between the two armies, defeating them separately before they could join forces. On June 16, 1815, Napoleon won a tactical victory at the Battle of Ligny, defeating the Prussians under Blücher. However, he failed to destroy their army, allowing them to retreat and regroup. At the same time, Marshal Michel Ney, one of Napoleon's most trusted commanders, fought a simultaneous battle against the British at Cape d'Ivoire. Although the battle was inconclusive, Ney's failure to press his advantage allowed the British army, led by the Duke of Wellington, to retreat northward to a defensive position near the village of Waterloo. Recognizing the importance of destroying Wellington's army before Blücher could arrive with Prussian reinforcements, Napoleon pursued the British to Waterloo. The stage was now set for a final, decisive battle that would determine the fate of Europe. Napoleon's forces, numbering around 73,000 men, faced off against Wellington's allied army of about 68,000, with Blücher's 50,000 Prussians marching to join the fray. The Battle of Waterloo began on the morning of June 18, 1815, in the fields near the village of Waterloo, located in present-day Belgium. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of Europe. On one side stood Napoleon Bonaparte, the brilliant military strategist who had returned from exile to reclaim his empire. On the other was the Duke of Wellington, commanding the British-led Allied forces, and Field Marshal von Blücher, leading the Prussian army, both determined to end Napoleon's ambitions once and for all. Napoleon's strategy for the battle was built around his traditional approach of concentrating force and delivering decisive blows. He intended to break through the center of Wellington's line, drive the British into disarray, and defeat them before Blücher's Prussian forces could arrive on the battlefield. The battlefield itself presented certain advantages for Napoleon. The French army was positioned on a ridge known as the Mont Saint-Jean, which provided a commanding view of the battlefield. Napoleon hoped to use this high ground to deliver effective artillery bombardments. A tactic that had served him well in previous battles. Napoleon planned to begin the battle with a diversionary attack on the Château d'If, a large farmhouse and fortified manor located on Wellington's right flank. This would tie down British forces and potentially lure Wellington into weakening his centre, making him vulnerable to a decisive French attack. Once the British right was engaged, Napoleon intended to launch a massive assault on Wellington's centre using infantry columns, supported by heavy artillery and cavalry. Wellington's tactics were known for his defensive prowess. He chose his position carefully. He had his army positioned along a reverse slope just behind the Mont Saint-Jean ridge. This positioning allowed his troops to be somewhat sheltered from direct artillery fire, which was one of Napoleon's primary strengths. Wellington's strategy was to hold the line and absorb the initial French attacks, buying time for Blücher's Prussian army to arrive and outflank Napoleon. Wellington's forces were a mix of British regulars, Dutch-Belgian troops, and soldiers from various German states. Despite the challenges of leading a multinational force, Wellington was confident in his troops' discipline and ability to hold their positions under pressure. His plan relied on using the terrain to his advantage, with key defensive positions on the right, the village of La Haye-Saint in the centre, and the Pibleté farm on the left. Wellington knew that if his army could hold out long enough, Blücher's arrival would turn the tide of the battle. The Prussian forces had been defeated at Ligny 2 days earlier but were not destroyed. Blücher, a determined and tenacious leader, had vowed to support Wellington, and his troops were marching to the battlefield as quickly as possible. The French attack on Hougoumont. The battle began at around 11:30 a.m. with a French attack on Hougoumont, as Napoleon had planned. The attack was initially intended as a diversion, but it quickly escalated into a fierce and prolonged struggle that would last for most of the day. Napoleon had hoped to draw Wellington's reserves away from the centre, but Hougoumont turned into a bloody stalemate. The French forces, commanded by Napoleon's younger brother, Jerome Bonaparte, launched wave after wave of infantry against the stoutly defended Hougoumont. The British Guards defending the farmhouse, along with Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, held their ground with tenacity. The thick walls of the farmhouse, combined with disciplined musket fire from the defenders, repelled repeated French assaults. Despite the intensity of the fighting at Hougoumont, Wellington refused to divert significant reinforcements from his main line. He understood that Hougoumont was a critical position, but he also recognized that Napoleon's main attack would come elsewhere. The battle at Hougoumont served as a microcosm of the larger conflict. with both sides suffering heavy casualties in brutal close-quarters combat. The French attack on La Haye-Sainte, with the fighting at Hougoumont tying down a significant portion of his forces. Napoleon turned his attention to the center of Wellington's line, particularly the village of La Haye. This farmhouse was located near the main road to Brussels and was a key defensive position for the British. Wellington placed a contingent of German troops, specifically the King's German Legion, to defend it. Around 1:30 p.m., Napoleon launched a major assault on La Haye-Sainte, hoping to break through Wellington's center and disrupt the entire British line. The French infantry advanced in dense columns, supported by artillery and cavalry. The defenders at La Haye-Sainte fought fiercely, holding off the French for several hours. But the French artillery began to take a toll on the British forces positioned on the ridge behind the village. Napoleon's artillery bombardment was intense, with over 200 cannons firing on Wellington's troops. The reverse slope offered some protection, but the constant bombardment began to wear down the Allied forces. Napoleon believed that a decisive breakthrough at La Haye-Sainte could lead to the collapse of Wellington's line, allowing the French cavalry to exploit the breach and secure victory. Wellington holds the line. Despite the pressure on his center, Wellington remained calm and resolute. He moved his reserves strategically, reinforcing weak points and ensuring that his line held firm. His decision to position his troops behind the ridge continued to pay off as it minimized the effectiveness of the French artillery. Wellington's leadership was a key factor in maintaining the cohesion and morale of his multinational force. As the afternoon wore on, the French were unable to capture La Haye-Sainte despite several determined assaults. The King's German Legion, though heavily outnumbered, fought with great valor, delaying the French advance and buying precious time for Wellington. The defenders eventually ran out of ammunition and were forced to withdraw. But by then, the critical hours had passed and the French had failed to achieve the breakthrough. Napoleon, frustrated by the lack of progress in the center, realized that time was slipping away. He knew that Blücher's Prussian army was approaching, and if they arrived before Wellington's line could be broken, the French would be caught between two armies. Napoleon's growing concerns as the battle wore on into the afternoon. Napoleon grew increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress in breaking through Wellington's center at La Haye. Despite the fierce assaults and heavy artillery bombardment, the British and Allied troops held their ground with remarkable tenacity. The French had managed to capture Hougoumont on the right flank, but this success did not lead to the breakthrough Napoleon had hoped for. By mid-afternoon, Napoleon received alarming reports from his scouts. Blücher's Prussian army, which he had believed to be thoroughly beaten at Ligny, was advancing towards the battlefield. Blücher had not only managed to regroup his forces, but was now marching determinedly to join forces with Wellington. This development was a significant threat. If the Prussians arrived before Wellington's lines could be broken, Napoleon's army would be caught between two enemies, a situation that could spell disaster for the French. The French cavalry charge. Realizing the urgency of the situation, Napoleon ordered Marshal Ney to launch a massive cavalry charge against Wellington's center. Ney, known for his bravery but also his impulsiveness, seized the opportunity. He gathered a large force of French cavalry, including cuirassiers, lancers, and dragoons, some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, and led them in a series of dramatic charges up the slope towards the ridge where Wellington's infantry was positioned. The sight of Ney's cavalry, glittering in their armor and riding with determination, was both impressive and terrifying. However, Ney had misjudged the situation. The British infantry, trained to withstand cavalry attacks, formed into squares. a defensive formation that was highly effective against cavalry. Each square was a solid block of soldiers with bayonets fixed outward, presenting a formidable barrier that horses were reluctant to charge. Wave after wave of French cavalry thundered up the ridge, only to be met by disciplined volleys of musket fire from the British squares. The French cavalry circled the squares, trying to find a weakness, but were unable to break through. The British squares held firm, their discipline and training paying off as they repelled the repeated attacks. Wellington's artillery also played a crucial role, targeting the French cavalry with devastating canister shots at close range. Ney, undeterred by the heavy casualties, continued to press the attack, sending in more cavalry in a desperate attempt to break the British line. But the lack of coordination with infantry and artillery support meant that the charges were ultimately futile. The French cavalry, exhausted and decimated, were forced to retreat, having failed to break Wellington's centre. The struggle for La Haye-Sainte, as the cavalry charges were repelled, Napoleon refocused his efforts on La Haye-Sainte, the farmhouse that had been stubbornly defended by the King's German Legion. By late afternoon, the French artillery had inflicted severe damage on the defenders, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. Sensing an opportunity, Napoleon ordered a renewed assault on the farmhouse this time. The French infantry managed to overwhelm the exhausted defenders. After hours of brutal fighting, La Haye-Sainte finally fell into French hands. This was a significant moment in the battle, as it gave Napoleon a foothold in the centre of Wellington's line and allowed the French to bring artillery forward to fire directly on the Allied troops positioned on the ridge. However, the capture of La Haye-Sainte came too late to be decisive. While it allowed the French to intensify their pressure on Wellington's centre, it did not cause the collapse that Napoleon needed. Wellington, aware of the critical nature of the situation, continued to move his reserves to reinforce the most threatened parts of his line, maintaining a defence that, while under immense strain, still held firm. The Prussian arrival as the French forces continued their assault. Blücher's Prussian army began to arrive on the battlefield. The first Prussian units, led by General von Bülow, appeared on Napoleon's right flank near the village of Planchenoit. The arrival of the Prussians added a new and dangerous dimension to the battle. Napoleon was now fighting a battle on two fronts, continuing his attacks on Wellington's centre while also trying to fend off the Prussians who threatened to outflank him. Napoleon quickly recognized the severity of the NTO situation and dispatched elements of his young guard and other reserves to hold off the Prussians. The fighting in and around Planchenoit was fierce, with both sides committing significant forces to the struggle. The French managed to hold the village for a time, but the Prussians, buoyed by their determination to avenge their earlier defeat at Ligny, continued to press forward relentlessly. As the Prussian pressure increased, Napoleon found himself increasingly stretched. His ability to coordinate the battle effectively was hampered by the need to respond to the growing threat on his right flank, and the strain on his forces was becoming evident. The Prussian advance also had a psychological impact on the French troops, who realized that they were now outnumbered and facing the combined might of two armies. By late afternoon, the French desperation was evident. By late afternoon, the battle was reaching its most critical phase. The French had made gains, particularly with the capture of La Haye-Sainte, but they had not broken Wellington's line. Meanwhile, the Prussian forces were steadily growing in strength as more units arrived on the battlefield. Napoleon was forced to make increasingly desperate decisions, committing his reserves to plug gaps in his lines and hold off the Prussians. The French troops were exhausted after hours of fighting, and morale was beginning to wane. The failure of Ney's cavalry charges, combined with the stubborn resistance of the British infantry and the growing Prussian threat, created a sense of unease among the French ranks. Napoleon, who had always relied on his ability to inspire and lead his men, now faced a situation where even his legendary charisma might not be enough to turn the tide. Wellington, aware of the precariousness of his position, continued to reinforce his line where necessary, but he also recognized that time was now on his side. The longer his army could hold out, the more the balance of power would shift in favor of the coalition forces as the Prussians brought their full strength to bear. As the sun began to set, the battle was far from over, but the momentum was starting to shift away from Napoleon. The combination of determined resistance from Wellington's forces and the growing pressure from Blücher's Prussians was beginning to take its toll on the French army. The stage was set for the final, decisive moments of the Battle of Waterloo. But for now, the outcome was still uncertain. The struggle at Plantagenet, as the late afternoon of June 18, 1815, progressed, the battle's dynamics shifted significantly with the arrival of the Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher. The Prussian advance, starting with General von Bülow, the Fourth Corps, was directed towards the village of Plantagenet, which lay on Napoleon's right flank. This village became the focal point of a fierce and crucial struggle. Napoleon understood the importance of holding Plantagenet, as its loss would allow the Prussians to outflank his army and possibly encircle the French forces. To counter the Prussian threat, he dispatched units of the Young Guard and elements of the Middle Guard, some of the most elite troops in his army, to reinforce the village. The fighting in Plantagenet was brutal and chaotic. The village, with its narrow streets and stone buildings, became a maze of deadly close-quarters combat. The French soldiers, aware that they were fighting to protect their comrades on the main battlefield, fought with desperate tenacity. They set up strong defensive positions, using the village's structures to create makeshift fortifications from which they could musket fire into the advancing Prussians. The Prussians, however, were equally determined. Motivated by their earlier defeat at Ligny and driven by Blücher's personal resolve to crush Napoleon, they attacked Plantagenet with relentless vigor. The Prussian infantry pushed through the streets and into the village, engaging in savage hand-to-hand combat with the French defenders. The village changed hands several times as each side committed more troops to the fight. Despite the ferocity of the French resistance, the Prussian numbers began to tell. Blücher continued to feed reinforcements into the battle, slowly but surely overwhelming the French defenders. By early evening, after hours of intense fighting, the Prussians managed to push the French back. The loss of Plantagenet was a severe blow to Napoleon, as it signaled that his right flank was in serious danger of collapsing. The deteriorating situation for the French, with the loss of Plantagenet and the increasing pressure from the Prussians, Napoleon's situation grew more precarious by the minute. His forces were now fighting on two fronts, against Wellington's resolute Anglo army in the center and left, and against a Prussian juggernaut advancing from the east. Napoleon, who had once commanded the battlefield with near total control, found himself stretched thin, his reserves depleted, and his army increasingly disorganized. Marshal Ney, who had been leading the French attacks on Wellington's center, was also facing mounting difficulties. Despite repeated cavalry charges and the eventual capture of La Haye-Saint, Ney was unable to break Wellington's line. The French infantry, battered by hours of combat and relentless artillery fire, was showing signs of exhaustion. The artillery, which had played a crucial role earlier in the day, was now less effective as ammunition began to run low, and the ground, churned up by thousands of feet and hooves, became increasingly difficult for the guns to traverse. Napoleon, aware that the situation was slipping out of his control, considered his options. He still had one last, formidable reserve: the Imperial Guard, the elite veterans who were his most loyal and battle-hardened troops. The Guard had not yet been committed to the fight, and their presence alone was often enough to inspire fear in the enemy and rally the French troops. However, Napoleon knew that sending the Guard into battle would be a desperate move. If they were to fail, the morale of the entire French army could collapse. Wellington's defensive tactics on the other side of the battlefield. The Duke of Wellington continued to execute his defensive strategy with remarkable skill and composure. Throughout the day, he had moved his troops with precision, reinforcing weak points and managing his reserves to counter the French assaults. Wellington's decision to position his troops on the reverse slope of the ridge had paid off, minimizing the damage from French artillery and allowing his forces to hold their ground against the relentless French attacks. Wellington was well aware that time was now working in his favor. The arrival of the Prussians meant that Napoleon's forces were under pressure from two directions, which reduced the intensity of the attacks on his own lines. Nevertheless, Wellington understood that his army was still in a precarious position. The French had made gains in the center, and the loss of La Haye-Sainte had allowed Napoleon to bring his artillery closer to the ridge, threatening the stability of Wellington's center. Despite these concerns, Wellington remained confident in his troops' ability to hold out. His men, a mix of British regulars, Dutch Belgians, and soldiers from various German states, had fought bravely throughout the day. The squares had held against May's cavalry, and the infantry had repelled numerous French assaults. Wellington knew that if his army could hold out a little longer, the combined strength of his forces and the Prussians would turn the tide decisively in their favor. The Imperial Guard prepares to attack. As evening approached, Napoleon made the fateful decision to commit his Imperial Guard to the battle. This was a move born of both desperation and hope. The hope that the Guard, with their experience and reputation, could deliver the decisive blow that would shatter Wellington's line and win the battle before the Prussians could fully deploy. Napoleon personally oversaw the preparations for the Guard's advance. The men of the Guard, dressed in their distinctive bearskin hats and dark blue uniforms, were the embodiment of French military pride. These were the soldiers who had fought alongside Napoleon in countless battles, who had marched across Europe and faced every conceivable challenge. They were feared and respected by their enemies, and their presence on the battlefield was a powerful symbol of Napoleon's enduring strength. The Guard formed up in columns, ready to march up the ridge and drive the British from their positions. As they began their advance, the French army looked on with a mixture of awe and hope. The sight of the Imperial Guard moving forward was a signal that the battle was reaching its climax, that victory or defeat would be decided in the next few moments. However, as the Guard advanced, they faced a well-prepared enemy. Wellington, anticipating that Napoleon might make one final, desperate attempt to break his line, had positioned his troops to meet the assault. The British infantry, still in their squares, stood ready to unleash disciplined volleys of musket fire. Wellington's artillery, though reduced in number, was also prepared to target the advancing French columns. As the Imperial Guard moved up the slope, they came under intense fire from the British and Allied forces. The British infantry, standing firm, unleashed devastating volleys that tore through the ranks of the advancing Guard. The French soldiers, trained to advance in the face of enemy fire, continued their march. But the weight of the British fire was overwhelming. The stalling of the Imperial Guard, As the Guard pressed forward, they encountered a series of increasingly fierce volleys from Wellington's troops. The discipline and firepower of the British infantry, combined with the effective use of artillery, began to take a severe toll on the advancing French columns. The Guard, who had previously seemed invincible, now found themselves struggling to maintain their advance. Wellington, observing the situation from his command post, ordered his troops to hold their ground and maintain their fire. He knew that breaking the Imperial Guard would have a devastating impact on French morale, as the British continued to pour musket and cannon fire into the French ranks. The momentum of the Guard's advance began to falter. Seeing the Guard's advance stall, Wellington ordered a counterattack. British and Allied infantry surged forward to engage the wavering French troops. The fighting was intense, with both sides locked in close combat. The Guard, still fighting with determination, tried to hold their ground, but the weight of numbers and the relentless British fire began to push them back. As the Guard began to fall back, the psychological impact on the French army was immediate and profound. The Imperial Guard had never been defeated in open battle, and their retreat signaled to the rest of the French forces that the battle was lost. The sight of the Guard, the pride of the French army, retreating down the slope shattered the morale of the remaining French troops. Panic began to spread, and the French lines started to disintegrate. The collapse of the French morale as the Imperial Guard began to falter and retreat. The impact on the rest of Napoleon's army was catastrophic. The sight of the Guard, an elite force revered throughout Europe for its invincibility, falling back in disarray had a profound psychological effect on the French troops who had been watching the advance with hope. For many, the retreat of the Guard signaled that the battle was lost, and the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface turned into outright panic. The French lines, already under immense pressure from Wellington's forces in the center and the advancing Prussians on the right flank, began to collapse. Soldiers who had been holding their positions for hours, exhausted and demoralized, started to break ranks and flee. The cohesion that had held the French army together throughout the day disintegrated, as more and more units began to withdraw or outright rout from the battlefield. Napoleon, who had placed so much faith in the Imperial Guard, was now faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation. He attempted to rally his troops, riding among them and urging them to stand firm, but the panic was too widespread. Even the presence of Napoleon himself was not enough to restore order. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded him and his army for so many years was shattered, and the battlefield descended into chaos. Wellington's counteroffensive. Seizing the moment, the Duke of Wellington ordered a general advance. Wellington, who had held his forces in a defensive posture for most of the day, now recognized that the time had come to go on the offensive and deliver the final blow to the French. His infantry, reinforced by the arrival of Prussian units, moved forward across the battlefield, engaging the retreating French forces. The British and Allied infantry, who had endured hours of relentless French attacks, now surged forward with renewed vigor. Their morale was high, buoyed by the sight of the Imperial Guard in retreat and the growing presence of the Prussians. The disciplined volleys of musket fire that had held the line throughout the day were now directed at the fleeing French soldiers, causing further casualties and adding to the Wellington's cavalry, which also joined the pursuit, charging into the disorganized French ranks and cutting down soldiers as they fled. The French artillery, which had played such a crucial role earlier in the battle, was largely abandoned as the gunners fled with the rest of the army. The Allied forces captured numerous guns, further crippling Napoleon's ability to resist. The Prussian assault on Plancenoit, while Wellington's forces pushed forward from the center. The Prussians continued their relentless assault on the French right flank, particularly around the village of Plancenoit. The Prussians, who had been gradually gaining ground throughout the late afternoon, intensified their attacks as the French army began to disintegrate. Blücher, who had vowed to destroy Napoleon after the defeat at Ligny, urged his men forward with renewed determination. The Prussians advanced in waves, overwhelming the remaining French defenders in Plancenoit and pushing them out of the village. The loss of Plancenoit meant that the French right flank was completely exposed, allowing the Prussians to move unopposed toward the center of the battlefield. As the Prussians advanced, they encountered little organized resistance. The French troops, now aware that they were being attacked from both the front and the rear, continued to flee in panic. The Prussian cavalry joined in the pursuit, adding to the chaos and driving the French soldiers further from the battlefield. Napoleon's final efforts, despite the collapse of his army, Napoleon refused to concede defeat. In one final, desperate effort, he attempted to rally the remnants of the Imperial Guard and other nearby units to form a last line of defense. The Guard, though depleted and exhausted, remained loyal to their emperor and gathered around him for a final stand. Napoleon positioned this last line of defenders on a ridge, hoping to delay the advancing Allied forces long enough to cover the retreat of the rest of his army. However, the situation was dire. The Guard, once the pride of the French army, was now reduced to a fraction of its former strength, and the soldiers were physically and mentally exhausted after hours of intense combat. Wellington, observing Napoleon's final efforts, ordered his troops to continue their advance. The British and Allied infantry, supported by cavalry and artillery, moved forward to engage the remnants of the French army. The Prussians, now pressing in from the right, closed in as well, encircling Napoleon's last defensive position. The final stand of the Imperial Guard was brief but intense. The Guard, true to their reputation, fought with remarkable bravery, repelling several assaults and inflicting significant casualties on the advancing Allied troops. However, they were vastly outnumbered and had no hope of victory. As the Allied forces closed in from all sides, the Guard began to break. Legend has it that when a British officer called for the Guard to surrender, one of the Guard's officers, General Pierre Cambron, famously replied, "Le Garde elle ne se rend pas." The Guard dies, it does not surrender. Whether or not these exact words were spoken, the sentiment reflects the resolve of the Guard to fight to the bitter end. The collapse and retreat as the Guard was finally overwhelmed. The remaining French forces fled the battlefield in disorder. The rout was complete. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran in every direction, many abandoning their uniforms in an attempt to blend in with the local population. The roads leading away from the battlefield were clogged with fleeing soldiers, artillery, and supply wagons, all in a state of utter disarray. Napoleon, recognizing that the battle was lost, withdrew from the battlefield with a small escort. He retreated to Paris, where he would soon face the reality that his rule was over. The French army, once the terror of Europe, was shattered and demoralized, and there would be no recovering from this defeat. Napoleon's departure from the battlefield as his army crumbled around him. Napoleon attempted to maintain some semblance of control. He briefly tried to rally a few units for a rearguard action, hoping to buy time for his troops to retreat in an orderly fashion. However, it quickly became clear that the situation was beyond saving. The disintegration of the Imperial Guard, which had always been his last line of defense, marked the end of any realistic hope of salvaging the battle. Recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, Napoleon reluctantly left the battlefield. accompanied by a small escort of loyal officers and bodyguards as he withdrew from the chaos. Heading south toward Charleroi, Napoleon's departure was not an admission of defeat, but rather a grim acknowledgement that the battle and his empire were lost. His thoughts likely turned to the future and the realization that his reign was coming to an end. As he rode away from the battlefield, Napoleon would have seen the full scale of the disaster unfolding behind him. The roads were clogged with fleeing soldiers, wagons, and artillery pieces, all moving in a disorderly mass. The once proud Grande Armée was reduced to a terrified mob fleeing for its life. The emperor, who had once held the fate of Europe in his hands, was now a fugitive heading back to Paris with the knowledge that his power was slipping away the Allied pursuit. Meanwhile, the Allied forces, sensing complete victory, pressed their advantage. The Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher, who had effectively coordinated their efforts throughout the day, now directed their forces to pursue the fleeing French. Wellington's infantry and cavalry continued to push forward, clearing the battlefield of any remaining French resistance while the Prussians took the lead in the pursuit, harrying the retreating French forces as they fled toward the south. Blücher, in particular, was determined to see Napoleon utterly defeated. The Prussian forces showed no hesitation in their pursuit, driving the French relentlessly through the night. Blücher had promised Wellington that he would not allow Napoleon to escape, and he intended to keep that promise. The Prussians captured thousands of French soldiers during the pursuit, further weakening Napoleon's already devastated army. The pursuit continued through the night and into the early morning of June 19th, with the French forces in full retreat. Many of the fleeing soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, were captured by the advancing Prussians. Those who managed to escape did so only by abandoning their equipment and slipping away into the countryside. The Prussians pushed the French all the way to the town of Genappe, where a brief rearguard action was fought before the French continued their flight. The battlefield aftermath. Back on the battlefield at Waterloo, the scene was one of horrific devastation. The fields that had been the site of such intense fighting were now strewn with the bodies of the fallen. The ground was churned up by the passage of thousands of men, horses, and artillery, and the once green fields were now stained with blood and littered with the debris of battle. Broken weapons, discarded uniforms, and the dead and dying. The Allied soldiers, who had fought so valiantly throughout the day, now began the grim task of tending to the wounded and burying the dead. The wounded, from both sides, filled makeshift field hospitals, where surgeons worked tirelessly through the night, performing amputations and trying to save as many lives as possible. The suffering was immense, as medical supplies were limited, and many of the wounded faced a slow and painful death from their injuries. Wellington himself was deeply affected by the sight of the battlefield. Despite the victory, he reportedly expressed little joy, recognizing the terrible cost in human lives. He later described Waterloo as the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, acknowledging how close the battle had been and how much it hinged on the arrival of the Prussians. The battlefield would become a site of both mourning and memory. In the years following the battle, it became a place of pilgrimage for those who wished to remember the fallen and reflect on the momentous events that had taken place there. Monuments were erected to commemorate the soldiers who had fought and died, and the name Waterloo became synonymous with final, decisive defeat. Napoleon's flight to Paris as the Allied forces pursued the remnants of the French army. Napoleon continued his flight toward Paris. The journey was marked by a growing sense of desperation and resignation. Napoleon, who had always prided himself on his ability to recover from setbacks and turn the tide of battle, now faced the harsh reality that his empire was crumbling around him. The news of the defeat at Waterloo spread quickly, and as Napoleon made his way back to Paris, he was met with a mixture of disbelief and despair from those who had remained loyal to him. The defeat shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded him for so long, and many of his supporters began to lose faith. The mood in Paris was somber, and there was a growing recognition that Napoleon's return to power had been a brief and doomed endeavor. Upon his arrival in Paris on June 21st, Napoleon attempted to rally political and military support for continuing the war. However, the French government, led by the Chamber of Deputies, had lost confidence in recognizing that the Allies would soon march on Paris, and that further resistance would only lead to more bloodshed. Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the second time. On June 22, 1815, this abdication marked the definitive end of Napoleon's rule and the collapse of the Napoleonic era. With no other options left, Napoleon surrendered to the British on July 15, 1815, and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The immediate aftermath in France, in the days and weeks following the Battle of Waterloo, France found itself in a state of political and social turmoil. Napoleon's defeat and subsequent abdication on June 22, 1815, marked the end of his brief return to power during the 100 Days. The French people, who had initially greeted Napoleon's return from exile with enthusiasm, were now faced with the grim reality of their situation. Politically, the collapse of Napoleon's regime left France without a clear leader. The Chamber of Deputies, dominated by those who had grown weary of Napoleon's endless wars, quickly moved to restore the Bourbon monarchy. Louis XVIII, who had fled Paris during Napoleon's return, was invited back to the throne. On July 8, 1815, Louis XVIII re-entered Paris, marking the second restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. However, the return of the Bourbons was met with mixed reactions. While some welcomed the return of stability and peace, many others, especially veterans of the Napoleonic Wars and those who had benefited from the changes brought about by the French Revolution, viewed the Bourbons with suspicion and resentment. The Restoration government faced the difficult task of reconciling a deeply divided nation. Royalists sought to reclaim their former privileges, while Republicans, Bonapartists, and liberal reformers were wary of a return to the old regime. Socially, the French population was exhausted after nearly 2 decades of constant warfare. The wars had brought both glory and suffering, with millions of lives lost and the economy severely strained. The defeat at Waterloo and the occupation of France by the coalition forces deepened the sense of national humiliation. The country was forced to accept the terms of the Second Treaty of Paris, signed on November 20, 1815, which imposed harsh conditions on France. The country was required to pay a large indemnity, return territories annexed during the Napoleonic Wars, and endure a military occupation by coalition forces until the indemnity was paid. The Congress of Vienna and the reordering of Europe. The Battle of Waterloo and Napoleon's final defeat had profound implications for the rest of Europe. Even before the battle, the victorious powers had been meeting at the Congress of Vienna, which began in September 1814, to negotiate the terms of peace and to redraw the map of the Congress aimed to restore stability and prevent the rise of another figure like Napoleon, who could disrupt the balance of power. With Napoleon's defeat, the decisions made at the Congress of Vienna gained finality. The leaders of the major powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, dominated the negotiations, each seeking to secure their own interests while creating a lasting peace. The Congress of Vienna established a new political order in Europe, often referred to as the Concert of Europe, which aimed to maintain the balance of power and prevent the outbreak of major conflicts. Some of the key outcomes of the Congress of Vienna included the restoration of monarchies. The Congress restored many of the monarchies that had been overthrown during the Napoleonic Wars, reinforcing the principle of legitimacy. This included the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France, the Habsburgs in Austria, and the reinstatement of many German and Italian rulers who had been displaced. Redrawing of borders. The Congress redrew the map of Europe, adjusting borders to create a balance of power. For example, the Austrian Empire gained control of northern Italy. Prussia expanded its territory in western Germany, and Russia acquired most of Poland. The German Confederation was created as a loose association of German states, replacing the dissolved Holy Roman Empire. Suppression of nationalism and liberalism. The conservative leaders at the Congress sought to suppress the forces of nationalism and liberalism that had been unleashed by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. They feared that these ideologies could lead to further revolutions and instability. As a result, the Congress restored autocratic rule in many areas and worked to repress revolutionary movements. Establishment of a balance of power. The Congress aimed to create a balance of power that would prevent any one nation from becoming too dominant in Europe. The great powers agreed to work together to maintain this balance, leading to a period of relative peace known as the Concert of Europe. This system would help to prevent major wars in Europe for much of the 19th century, though it also stifled the aspirations of nationalist and liberal movements. Social and cultural impact in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent settlement at the Congress of Vienna had a significant impact on European society and culture. The wars had spread many of the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty and peace, equality and fraternity across Europe, even as the old monarchies were restored. These ideas could not be entirely suppressed, and they continued to influence political and social movements throughout the 19th century. One of the most enduring legacies of the Napoleonic era was the rise of nationalism. While the Congress of Vienna sought to suppress nationalist movements, the very act of redrawing borders and restoring old regimes often fueled nationalist sentiments. People in regions like Italy, Germany, and Poland began to aspire to nationhood, seeking to create unified states that reflected their shared cultural and linguistic identities. These aspirations would eventually lead to the unification of Germany and Italy later in the 19th century. Culturally, the Romantic movement, which had been growing since the late 18th century, was further inspired by the events of the Napoleonic Wars. Romanticism emphasized emotion, individualism, and the sublime, often focusing on the heroic, the tragic, and the awe-inspiring aspects of human experience. The figure of Napoleon himself became a symbol in Romantic literature and art, both as a tragic hero and as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. The political landscape of Europe after Waterloo was one of conservative reaction, but it was also one where the seeds of future revolutions were sown. The conservative rulers who had triumphed over Napoleon attempted to restore the old order, but the changes brought by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars could not be entirely undone. The 19th century would be marked by a series of revolutionary movements and wars for independence, as peoples across Europe sought to assert their rights and create nation-states. In France, the Bourbon monarchy struggled to maintain control in the face of deep-seated divisions within the country. The tension between royalists, Bonapartists, Republicans, and liberals created an unstable political environment that would eventually lead to the Revolution of 1830 and the establishment of the July monarchy under Louis-Philippe. In Britain, the defeat of Napoleon reinforced the country's position as a dominant global power. The British Empire expanded rapidly in the 19th century, benefiting from the relative peace in Europe and the Industrial Revolution. Politically, Britain avoided the revolutionary upheavals that affected much of Europe, partly due to its tradition of gradual reform and parliamentary government. In Germany and Italy, the nationalist movements that had been stifled by the Congress of Vienna would eventually lead to the unification of both countries. The push for German unification culminated in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, leading to the proclamation of the German Empire. In Italy, the Risorgimento movement led to the unification of Italy under the leadership of figures like Garibaldi and Cavour. The legacy of Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo, and the end of the Revolution signaled the end of one era, the era of revolutionary and Napoleonic expansion, and the beginning of another, characterized by the struggle between conservative forces and the emerging ideologies of nationalism, liberalism, and socialism. Waterloo became a symbol of ultimate defeat and the end of ambition for power at all costs. Napoleon, once the master of Europe, spent his final years in exile on the island of St. Helena, writing his memoirs and reflecting on his legacy. His downfall served as a warning to future leaders about the dangers of overreaching, but it also left a lasting imprint on European society, politics, and culture. The peace established by the Congress of Vienna held for several decades, but the forces it sought to suppress would eventually reassert themselves, leading to further conflict and change. The 19th century, shaped by the legacy of Waterloo, would see the rise of nation-states, the spread of democratic ideals, and the eventual decline of the old empires. As we've explored, the Battle of Waterloo was not just a military conflict, but a turning point that reshaped the political and social landscape of Europe. It marked the end of an era, bringing down one of history's most ambitious figures and setting the stage for a century of change and upheaval. Napoleon's legacy, both as a brilliant strategist and a cautionary tale, continues to influence our understanding of leadership, power, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. The events that followed Waterloo remind us of the delicate balance between peace and conflict, and how the actions of a few can alter the course of history. When the smoke cleared at Waterloo and Napoleon breathed his last on a deserted island, an era officially came to an end. In this event, which completed this frightening and suffocating scene, we witnessed how ambition and fate collided. Take care of yourselves until we meet again on the next voyage of discovery.